Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about unneeded realistic designs. What I mean by this is I was talking to a friend who's actually in the game industry, never worked with them, so industry distant colleague. And he asked me a very simple question. He said, how come you've never really had weather in a lot of your games? And I started saying things like, well, it wasn't connected. I didn't connect it to anything, and we did other things for visual variation. But really, full screen effects can be expensive, whether 2D or 3D, for different reasons, which I'll talk about. And he said, well, you did time of day in a lot of your games. There was time of day in Fallout. There was time of day in Arcanum. And the Arcanum one mattered. I mean, there were traits you could get for day mage and night mage, similarly like indoor and outdoor mage. And he said one thing I noticed was not only did the shadows move, and they did, although I'm wondering if that made it for Arcanum, but he said one thing he did notice was that the coloration was different for dawn and dusk. And I remember adding that, and yeah, I did that even though colorblind, because the artist said, yeah, dusk and dawn look different. Dawn's a little blue tinted and dusk is a little red tinted, and I added that in. Even though at the time, all it looked like was dawn did look blue tinted, but dusk just looked like we were dimming the pixels. I've talked on this channel about fun versus realism, and I'll link that video below. I'm not going to repeat that. I've even talked about what is fun by itself. I've just talked about fun in and of itself, which can be very subjective. I link that below. What I want to talk about is adding realistic features and why you should or shouldn't. And I do have videos like encumbrance. In fact, I got a 2-part on encumbrance. Because that is a feature that you may think I added for the realism, but it really was included more for the challenge. It wasn't included. What I want to make clear is it wasn't included because it was realistic. That wasn't the only reason. And that's what I want to talk about here. It's like, let's talk about realistic features, how they get implemented, and why that can be expensive, and why you may not want them in your game. And I'll talk about different ones. And they all kind of, after a while, you'll see that when I get to the pros and cons, it's like just the same as the one before. So let's go through these. Let's start with weather, because that's what my friend asked me about. This is where you have rain or snow or fog or something in your game. Looks cool. I will totally agree. And it also provides variation. People go back to the same location and it's raining. It can look a little different. They go back to an area and it snowed. It can look a lot different. But let me just tell you that this can be very expensive to do. Making puddles appear, making footprints, you step through a puddle and then you leave wet footprints, or there's snow and you leave footprints in the snow. No matter how this is done, whether in 2D it's done with decals and swapping out tiles and even walls for the snow version, or whether it's done in 3D with, we can do materials to make things look wet, and I can do a pixel shader and stuff like that. It doesn't matter. It's extra work and extra either memory and or CPU time, and sometimes both. So you are paying for this. Whether you like it or not, you are paying for these effects. And my point here is, unless they're somehow integrated into the system mechanics somehow, then it just becomes window dressing. If you can't get some bonus like I fight better in the snow, or there are cold effects that happen. When I go into an area and it's cold and snowy, I may get a debuff put on me. Or if I throw a fire-based spell in heavy rain, it gets debuffed a little bit. Or maybe it doesn't have its side effects. Maybe a fireball would still burn someone, but they wouldn't get a fire damage over time, a fire dot effect put on them. If it doesn't have things like that, I do question, why are you adding it? It doesn't change the game in a material way. It's just window dressing. And you have to ask yourself, look at the expense of it, and is that a worthwhile window dressing? And especially look at it this way. The time you're spending to make the same area look rainy is time your artist could have spent making a whole different area. So you may have a wealthy version of the town, and you may make a little shanty version, another neighborhood of the town. Well, guess what? You may lose one of those neighborhoods because you wanted to make the nice version look different when it's wet. You will be paying for that difference. And I'm going to be bringing this up repeatedly. It is a big deal. You should be thinking about this. And let's go to the other thing that he and I talked about, which was time of day. And that's done with lighting and shadow, coloration. It is. I'm not going to talk much about that, but I will tell you, time of day looks great, but it's expensive. And it's expensive for a whole bunch of different reasons. You know, you have to do shadows can be expensive to do. And sometimes a scene looks really good when it's been pre-rendered with wonderful baked-in shadows. And then you switch to real-time lighting and it's just not as good because real-time lighting, you usually have to cut corners to make it something that you can do without destroying your frame rate. But real-time lighting is great if like you want to cast a fireball and when it shoots off, you can see all the shadows change. That's great. I get it. It looks gorgeous. And I'm the first one to say beauty sells. People will look at your game if it's gorgeous. But I always ask, does it matter? Does the game change materially because of it? And again, I think about in Arcanum, we had time of day because we had day mages and night mages. We had indoor mages and outdoor mages. It mattered. Time of day could matter. Also, when you shot someone with a ranged weapon, the lighting was taken into account, so it was harder to shoot someone far away when it was dark. When you stealthed in Arcanum, it took in the ambient lighting conditions, so it was easier to sneak around at night than during the day. I don't know how many people figured that out, but it was way easier to do that. So it mattered. So Arcanum got time of day because it was visually cool, but it also mattered in system mechanics. Let's go on to another one. Eating and drinking. You know, that's a great use of consumables. You put a bunch of consumables in the game like healing potions. You can also put food and drink, and they can have effects when you eat them. You can have backgrounds that have dietary restrictions. You want to play a vegan character? There goes all the animal products. You can associate it with difficulty levels like we did with Outer Worlds, where you didn't need to eat or drink unless you played Supernova. So again, that's an example of it going into the mechanics of the game. But you have to ask yourself, if you just add eating and drinking for no other reason than to have it in your game, is it fun to manage that for the player? Forget all the implementation stuff you now have to do, because all these things have to be created and put in and programming, and a good user interface has to be made for this that conveys to the player, you're getting hungry, you're getting thirsty. Is it fun for the player to deal with all that? And how much time did you spend balancing it and making that UX look good? And especially when you think of food, you have to think in terms of quantity, quality, and nutrition. And suddenly you have all these different things. You've got to look at your consumables in a completely different way. It wasn't just, hey, we have bread in the game and you can bake it as part of crafting and then it gives you 5 hit points back if you eat it. No. You have to think for eating and drinking, how much does it satiate you? You know, is it good for you? Because if you eat just one thing, is the game going to take that into account or not? It can get complicated fast until after a while you realize, I'm just making an eating sim. And is that what you really want to do? Very similar to this would be sleep. I've made games where you have to sleep. I've had exhaustion effects. This can be interesting to introduce to the game because now the player has to find a safe place to sleep. And sleeping can be anything from, you're fine if you don't sleep, but if you want to get like certain spells back or restore your health completely or your mana completely, you have to sleep. You have to go find a safe place to do it because you don't want a random encounter to occur. Maybe you have to pay to sleep. Maybe it's a money sink. When you're traveling, maybe it takes into account sleep periods. So when you move across the world map, that's taken into account of how long it takes to get somewhere. But you have to ask yourself, is it fun for the player to manage not just the quantity of sleep their character has to do, but the quality? And you all know what I'm talking about. You've played games where if you pay for a nice inn, you get a buff for sleeping. But if you just roll your bedroll out on the dungeon floor, not only might you get interrupted, but you don't get as good sleep. These are all mechanics that you can introduce to make sleep worthwhile. But again, if you do that for everything, are you making a fun RPG or are you making a immersive sim? I always tell people, go back and look at your goals. If your goal was not to make a realistic simulation of a role-playing world, then you may want to question why you're doing all this. Disease is another one where disease is often put into a game so that spells and wounds And even food can introduce disease to the player that becomes both a visual and a system mechanic, a status effect. So it has effects on the player. And like I just mentioned, you can work it into the game system mechanics. Mummy rotting disease is a great one from D&D. You know, if you don't support disease mechanics, mummies are not nearly as frightening because they're supposed to hit you and cause a mummy disease that lasted a while. And it gave a good reason, by the way, another good reason to have a good constitution. High constitution characters don't get disease very often. And when they do, the disease runs its course very quickly. You can also make perks and feats or whatever your game has to make disease even more interesting. But is it fun? And how much of your user interface are you going to devote to telling player, this is your current disease status, this is the stage the disease is at, how easy is it to find the material, the consumable in your in your inventory to do something about that disease, to manage it? Are there entire spells that just exist to cure disease, so they do nothing else in the game but get rid of a status effect that you get from some other part of the game? Is this what you want? If this is not part of your design goals, why are you adding it? Those are all the big ones I could think of. I could go on and on about all the different realistic details that you may or may not want in your game, but they all boil down to the same thing, which is, if you're considering adding a realistic feature, ask yourself, is it worked into the game mechanics somehow? Is it reflective of the goals, the design goals that you wrote down for the whole game and the section of the game where this realistic feature would work in, whether it's time of day or disease? Does that part of the game need something that realistic feature is supporting? And then beyond challenge, beyond all of that, is it fun for the player? Is it interesting for the player to interact with? If it's not, if it's just there to make the game challenging, it'll probably also make the game frustrating. So you want to ask yourself that. And then third, you really want to ask yourself about the implementation. How much extra art is needed? How much extra code is needed? How much extra time is needed at the intersection between art and code? You know, I'm talking pixel shaders and materials that have to work a very certain way for that realistic feature to work. I'm not even factoring in the design time you spent doing it, the audio time. People want, hey, you know, I want it to sound, I want good rain sound. I want my footsteps to sound different on the road when there's snow on the road. All the decals you have to make for the footsteps, and maybe they have to decay because you can't have too many decals on the screen at once. These are all things that are part of your implementation costs. Don't even get me started that you now have to make a playtest plan for all of these things for QA to look into. You have just increased your game's cost and complexity a lot, and ask yourself, is it worth it? So I hope that helps you if you're thinking about adding something realistic to your game just for the sake of it being realistic.